All right, so I've given you a week to think seriously about what I said last week. For those of you who were here last week. Hopefully you gave a lot of thought to what I had mentioned in verse 7. This is Isaiah chapter 3, verse 7. What I handed out today is chapter 3, verse 9 to 11. So if you didn't bring last week's piece of paper that I had handed out, well, maybe you could bring this week's next week. No, I've got some extras up here. You can get them later if you like. So if you don't have one, that's fine. Just listen to what I'm going to tell you. In verse 7, a more literal translation from a thought-for-thought point of view would be when, well, I'll start out in verse 6. It's really the place to start. Because what happens is that somebody gets seized. Somebody gets seized. They say, "You be our leader," because you're the one who's got clothing. And so, "You be our leader." In verse 6, it would say, "For a man will seize his brother in the house of his father. You have clothing. You will be a leader for us, and this ruin will be under your hand." And I'm sure that everyone would be excited to hear this, right? Because everyone wants to be in charge. And don't you all want to be in charge? You want to have absolute authority and no responsibility at all. Okay? I know that's kind of a fleshly point of view. Everybody wants to have all authority and not have any responsibility for the consequences of whatever they declare, or however they're authoritative, how they affect other people's lives. If something falls apart in your life, just don't ask me to fix it. All right? Now, but in this case, there is nothing but destruction and disaster, and they're trying to find someone who will take authority over all of the destruction that is the result of previous people who were in charge. And they want him to find some way to reorganize and use whatever's left over in order to reconstruct and rebuild things in some way. But what I was explaining last week was that people are looking for somebody else to assume responsibility for them. Now that's really what is inherently behind this. They say, we do not want to do whatever is necessary to provide ourselves with our own clothing, with our own food, with our own way of life. We want somebody else to do that. We want a king who will be in charge, who will take that position. All right? Now, I know this might sound a little bit odd, but the peasants and the lords and the kings, the days of old, not this old, but, in between time period, Middle Ages kinds of people. The peasants they had it pretty good, in many respects. They had it pretty good because if they were a lord, then they would have other peasants who would be looking to them to provide them with all the safety and security, and if they start going hungry, give them some work to do, that kind of thing. The peasants really had to assume a lot of responsibility, or be willing to assume a lot of responsibility if they were wanting to become a lord, if they wanted to have ownership of land and be responsible to pay taxes to the king. All right, now of course there's variations concerning this in all kinds of circumstances. There were lots of peasants who did exceptionally well and discovered how they could assume responsibilities for themselves in some circumstances without having all the responsibilities to pay as much taxes to the king as the lord would, and so they actually did quite well. There were loopholes, in other words, in order to prosper. But it takes a special personality sometimes, it seems, in order to assume responsibility for yourself. In this case, we have a clear statement of the people looking for somebody else who's got some stuff to give to them, which is effectively what this means. You've got some stuff, we'll make you in charge, and what that means is that you will give to us whatever you have, or you will go and find someone else who has some stuff and take it from them to give to us. All right? It's a common model. It's not unusual at all. But what he sees, or what he smells, I prefer to say, what this guy smells coming in advance, you can see the wisdom that this person has when he responds and says, no, I am not going to be in charge. Now that's a very powerful statement. People think that it's extremely powerful to say, yes, I will take charge. But there's great power in saying, no, I'm not going to take charge. I'm not going to assume authority. I'm not going to assume responsibility over this disaster. This is your disaster. You find a way to clean it up. There's a tremendous amount of power there. People assume that everybody just wants to be in charge, but there are some people who understand that there are times and who they have the wisdom to know when you do not want to be in charge. And this is one of those times when you have people who are just looking for somebody else to assume responsibility and take care of them instead of looking to someone and saying, you have clothing, why don't you show us how to make some clothes? How about that? Oh no. What they want to do is they want to ride on this person. And that would be a better translation of the following verse, verse 7, where it says, he will rise up in that day to say, I will not be bound. I will not be bound. And then I give a further definition of that word for bound, because we have a lot of different words for binding things. But a more complete definition of that would be to say, like you would saddle a donkey to ride him. He could smell it coming. Right? You be our king. Oh no, you're not going to ride me like a donkey. And you would think that seems like such an odd response. What about, oh yes, I will be king. No. So you're not going to ride me like a donkey. Why? Because there are people who will look to a king as someone who you ride like a donkey. And there are others who will look to a king who will say, no, we're not going to ride you, but we do want to know what wisdom you have. We want someone who has a sense of temperance, who has a sense of justice, and has some fortitude. How about that? And that is the kind of person who will assume the responsibilities of a king, which is not someone to be ridden until they're dead, if necessary, but someone who will resolve conflict, someone who will be just, someone who can be given wealth and will use it appropriately, as opposed to just waste it into ruin. All right? Those are the kinds of kings that people, you would hope that they would want. But no, if you want to be the king, you got to be careful what people you're the king of, because you might find yourself bound and ridden like a donkey. All right? And that because they look at you that way. And what I was explaining last week was that people view God in that way. They view Him in that way. But before I did that, I explained that people will view pastors that way. So I've given you a week to think about that. Nobody called me about that. Think about that. That people will view, all we need is the right pastor. Right? I mean, haven't you heard that kind of a bizarre phrase? We just need the right pastor, the right leader. And I'm telling you that will never, ever work. That will never, ever be the case. All right? Now, it depends on your goal, I suppose. I mean, there's some guys who are more suitable for building 20,000 member congregations than others. I am definitely not that person. If I was offered a congregation of 20,000 people, I mean, the kind of rules I would place down would sound something like Corinthians. And people would not be happy about that. People ask me things like, why is it that women would be silent in the church, or that Paul would require that? I say, you try to take over a synagogue. You try that. A synagogue has very unique social dynamics. And if you've got a bunch of aggressively religious Jewish people, Jewish families, who all of a sudden believe that Jesus is the Messiah, and you want to drag them out of the law, you're going to need a rule like that. Okay? I mean, especially when it comes to the festivals and the Sabbath law, I mean, the dynamics are enormous. I'm just simply not suitable to do that necessarily. All right? I mean, I know what it would take, but they probably wouldn't be interested in that. So, those are the kinds of decisions that people make. For a major congregation, for example, there was a congregation that was without a pastor at one time, I think 5 years ago or something, and people were suggesting to me, well, why don't you go over there and talk with them about taking their place? They said, are you kidding me? The place which is a mile wide and a 1/4 inch deep, and I'm going to shrink it down to a 1/4 inch wide and a mile deep? That place will be crushed under the load of its debt because people will flee and never return after 5 sermons. Okay? It really does depend on the people. It's not the pastor. It's not the leader. But people will look at the pastor as the guy who we saddle up and ride him until he's dead. Okay? And there are people who will accommodate that and then, go out in flames. Burn out for Jesus. You know, there's a major problem with pastoral burnout. All right? So I've given you a week to think about that, and I want you to take this a little bit further now, if you hopefully have been considering these things. I mentioned last week the importance of seeing God from that point of view. That there are a lot of people who see Him as someone who they saddle up like a donkey and ride Him. They view Him that way. There are people, I know it might sound a little bit bizarre, perhaps you'll recognize a few things if I mention some things that you may not have considered to fit into that category before, but there are people who really do view God from that point of view. And it may be difficult to understand, and it may be difficult to embrace, but I want you to know that the good thing is that God knows when to say no. I mean, He's extraordinary when it comes to that, which is why I showed you in the previous verses that God turned away. He turned away. He wasn't taking people away. He wasn't taking their bread and water away. He was just simply turning away. He realized that He was the heavenly enabler of all the sin and the evil, and He says, you know, I think I'll just not participate anymore. You cannot seize God like these people were trying to seize this man to make him king so they could ride him. You cannot seize God so that you may ride Him. It isn't going to happen. It has never happened. It never will happen. And people discover this on occasion after they attempt to seize God and ride Him like a donkey. Perhaps you've heard people say things like, now I prayed, and I got in a prayer chain, and I got 50 people praying. We ganged up on Him. And He still didn't answer our prayer in the way that we wanted Him to. We're confused. We're disturbed. We think that maybe this God might not be real. All right? And then, well, you don't hear about those people. I'm the one who has to deal with those people. Because, you know, they leave the church, and then they don't go back, and then they call me later. All right? Now, listen. This is a belief that people have, that you may seize God. And then He will provide you with the clothing, and the food, and the cow, and the Cadillac. And anything else that comes FedEx. Right? That He's got the heavenly warehouse that He begins to dispense. People have this belief that He is one who can be seized and then ridden like a donkey. And He won't allow it. He's just not that kind of a God. He's not into that. All right, now let me give you a little bit more of an expansionary point of view. All right, I thought I'd maybe spend some time talking about how we relate to each other in that way, but that might be a little too sensitive, and so I'll see if I can avoid that. But think about that this week at least. How, you know, you may know of people in your life who have that attitude of they just look for someone who they can seize and ride. All right, because there are people like that everywhere. But instead, let's, what was I going to say? I didn't get enough sleep last night. Last week it was allergies, now it's lack of sleep. It was all troubling. So now I can't even remember what I was gonna move on into. God cannot be seized. He's not the heavenly vending machine, the heavenly gumball machine in the sky. He's not going to allow people to just ride Him to the end of the earth. I can't really remember. So I'll go ahead and talk about us. And then it'll spontaneously come back to me, and I'll be back on track. All right. Now we tend to treat each other that way. Sometimes we do that, and it's really unfortunate. But people do relate to other people in that context, and it has to do with the refusal to assume personal responsibility for ourselves. All right. It's a fleshly dynamic. It's a fleshly issue that we just don't want to produce more than what we consume, for example. So we look for somebody who has produced more than what they have consumed, and so maybe we can get a piece of the difference. And sometimes we relate to people on that basis, where we attempt to seize them in some way and invade in their lives, get in their way, whatever. And it actually is a form of violence that is perpetrated against other people. And this is the tool that they use, and now I can be back on track. What they use is they use the goodness of an individual as a weapon against them. Remember me saying that last week? They use the goodness of God as a weapon against them. That's the idea, is that they say, well, you know, God is a good God, and so if He is a good God, then this is how we will define what goodness is, He should be able to dispense whatever we have a desire for, whatever we have a need for, upon command, upon demand, and then through that we can go ahead and ride him out like a donkey. Okay? And if he fails to do that, then we call him evil. And then he feels guilty or ashamed, and then he'll comply. And that is an exercise of violence, is what it is. It's an exercise of violence using the goodness of an individual as a weapon against them. And God will not allow that. Now there's a subtlety that takes place amongst us hyper-gracers. Alright? There's a I answered a question on that in a live Q&A this morning. That, depending upon your definition, absolutely I would be considered a hyper-gracer. In other cases, absolutely not. But one of the unique struggles that people have when we talk about grace, you'll hear me say so much about we have a need for the love of God, we have a need for the acceptance of God. And the reason why we commit sins is because we are deceived into thinking that through the commission of those sins, the needs that we have will be met. People commit a lot of sins because they just want somebody to love them, commit a lot of sins because they want somebody to like them, to accept them. Those are the root issues that we struggle with that lead us to commit sin. And so, of course, the dynamic then becomes turning to the Lord who meets those needs that we have deep down inside. And that gives us the freedom to be able to say no to the temptations of life. That's where life can begin to change. But then how do we view God? We can view God as one whom we seize. Whom we seize and say, thou lovest me. You must accept me. And we stop losing track of the fact that it actually is a gift of God. It's not something that we're able to just take. It really is something that's given. Another dynamic that makes this very difficult for people to consider has to do with pride. That we think that we're just so wonderful that that God has to love us or He has to accept us. Is because we exist. Because I exist, because He created me, He owes me. And I am here for Him. I even provide Him with sin to forgive. Can you sense the pride of that? Alright, now this is hard to spot. I want you to know that this is a deep-rooted sense of pride. It's really hard to spot. It's easier to spot in other people than yourself, that's for sure. So ask somebody else to talk to you about your own. But there's a subtlety where people say, yeah, I've got some good sin, and so God can love me. And so I actually provide a service for God. I provide a service. I give Him someone to forgive. I give Him someone to love. I give Him someone to accept. And I'll seize Him in order to remind Him on occasion that that's what He's here for. That's what I'm here for too. That's what we're here for. And in effect, that becomes the mutual participation. We give ourselves to Him so that He can love us and forgive us and give us all we need in the depths of our being. And we provide that service for Him. Right? It becomes an act of service to give God someone that He can love and accept. So what's the payment for the service? There is no payment. There's only debt. See, He owes you now. Alright? He owes you because you provided Him this service of giving Him someone to love and accept and forgive. So now He owes you a debt. And people will relate to God in that way. And they express it in their prayers. Things like, well, Lord, I've been doing pretty good with my sin recently. Or I've been, and I don't mean that in the sense of giving you more to forgive, although some weirdos take that approach. But, I've been reducing it a little bit, reducing the burden, on your heart. And so, I think you should compensate me a little bit for that, in addition to that. But see, that becomes a difficult struggle in people's lives and in their hearts. And they don't realize that the mutual relationship and participation has to do with other things besides this. All right, let me try to bring this a little bit more down to earth. Okay, and then you can review the audio on this later. A little bit more down to earth. Have you ever encountered someone that you just give to, and you give to, and you give to, and yet they seem to harbor this great sense of resentment towards you? Have you ever? Not everybody's encountered that. All right. So if you have any friends who might struggle with this question of why they just give, and they have maybe somebody in their life where they have the perfect give and take relationship with. They give, the other person takes. It's a perfect fit, right? Okay, and you wonder, well, why is this person so angry with me? Why is it that they're so resentful with me? Well, one of the reasons why, and this is a fleshly concern, is because the person who is being the recipient believes that they are providing an act of service. They're providing an act of service. Well, see, I am here so that you can give to, and that's my service. My service, my contribution is that I take whatever you give. And it makes you look good, especially in public, right? Because you provide for me, or you do things for me, or whatever. Men and female side, both dynamics. It happens in both ways, where they will parade around in order to boast in how they give to the other person. All right, it's a struggle. It really is. It's a real struggle. But see, what is given then is no longer payment. Now you're in debt. All right. For example, this can be a struggle between married couples. If the husband is working and the wife is not working, sometimes this becomes a struggle because the husband gives money to the wife, and the wife receives it, saying that I have now made you a great husband because I have received the money for you. I have done my part. You're a good man, and so you need someone to give to demonstrate your goodness, and I will provide that service. Now, because I have provided this service, you owe me. But you're out of money. That's okay. I'll hold it on your account. Now, over a period of time, that account gets kind of big. And then there's this form of resentment that shows up because you're not getting compensated adequately for your service. All right? This does not always happen, of course. All right? You may not be able to relate to this, but you may encounter other people who sometimes will encounter those kinds of issues. All right? And then there's resentment. Resentment for lack of payment. Now, this is how people relate to God when He doesn't answer their prayers. This is where the resentment comes from. Or when they do service, or they're engaged in ministry, or whatever, they begin to harbor this resentment towards God because they were there for Him. Right? We were, I provided my service, which was presenting my wicked, evil, sinful self for you to love. And your love, was given, and I'm pretty good now that I provide you for, but you owe me for that. Okay? There's got to be more. There's got to be more. All right? These are the kinds of struggles that lead to these attitudes where people have, where they say, we need to find someone who we can ride like a donkey. Okay? This is the root of it. This is where it begins. This is where it surfaces. And sometimes people have to have some wisdom to be able to sense when this is coming, so they can say no early instead of later. Because if it's too late, it ends in violence, which is what happens between people and the Lord. It ends in violence, where people get angry at God, right? And they reject Him, and they do so publicly. And they say, He's a wicked, evil God, this horrible God of yours. And you find out when you try to talk to them about Him and His love and acceptance and mercy. And they say, well, He didn't this, and He didn't, and He did this, and did that, and He owes me still, and He still hasn't paid up. And it's a real struggle, all right? So I want you to see that what we have described here in verse 6 and 7, I want you to understand that it is not an unusual challenge, all right? It's not an unusual challenge, and not an unusual circumstance. All right, now I'm going to go ahead and proceed into verse 9 with the paper that I handed out earlier. In Isaiah chapter 3, verse 9, I'm going to read through the thought for thought just to give you a general perspective on what is conveyed here. The recognition in their faces testifies against them, and their sin is like Sodom. They declare, they do not conceal and cease. Woe to their souls, their very being. They brought evil upon themselves. tell the righteous that good, and this is a little awkward here, that good, comma, little pause, that they will eat the fruit of their deeds. Woe to evil, wicked, because of the recompense of his hands, it will be done to him. Now I'm going to start off in verse 11 and work my way back a little bit. I think it will flow a little bit better with the way that we think in English in order to handle it that way in this case. In verse 11, at the end, the bottom of that page, it says, woe to evil. You know, he doesn't say woe to the evil people. He doesn't really put that in there that way. He really does leave it kind of wide open, saying woe to evil and woe to wicked. He's not saying wickedness or wicked people. There are ways of writing that, and he just didn't write it those ways. How did the New King James Version handle it? I didn't even look. In verse 11, let me take a peek. Woe to the wicked, it shall be ill with them. Woe to the wicked, it shall be ill with them. I wouldn't put that definite article, the, in there necessarily, because Isaiah didn't put it in there. We have a definite article for the. It's not difficult to write. We just didn't do it. He just says openly, woe to evil, wicked, because of the recompense of his hands. Now, at that point, you could put a definite article. He's talking about a person and the recompense, the results, payment of his hands. It's okay to stick a definite article in there. But I chose not to, just to try to expand the thought in English a little bit more, to reflect a little bit more than what it would say in the Hebrew, kind of an open-ended description. But this word recompense for his hands is followed up with it will be done to him. And I want you to see that. I want you to see that there is a result of his hands and that it will be done to him. And that there really is great value in seeing these two statements, because normally it's either one or the other, it seems, but not both. This is what I mean. When a person engages in wickedness or evil, most of the time the consequences are experienced by somebody else. You know, if a person sins, for example, it doesn't normally affect them as much as it affects whoever they sinned against. That's the one, the one who was violated. That's the one who really gets it. And the one who committed the sin, you may get the sense that on occasion they get away with it in some ways. Well, what would they be able to do anyway? I mean, sin can be so evil, so wicked, that there is nothing that can be done. It's just that bad. And that, that requires forgiveness at that point. So I want you to see that he really did intentionally write something that says the recompense of his hands, in the sense that there is a consequence. But that doesn't necessarily mean that he's the one who's going to be the recipient of it. It's the second statement that really exaggerates the fact, and that will be done to him also. Right? And that this is the scenario at hand. That we have people who have destroyed their lives. Absolutely destroyed their lives, destroyed their country, and they've done so according to their own decision. And what was God's participation in that? He provided the food and the water. And all the resources that they decided to use inappropriately. And then he eventually decided, I think I'm just going to pull back a little bit and not be a participant in this evil and in this destruction. And it is the destruction from people's own hands. And as a result of his withdrawal, it will be much easier for people to suffer consequences from their own actions, as opposed to him being present, where they would not necessarily suffer as much. Right? Because those who are committing evil require resources to do it. And if he pulls those resources out, it's going to be much difficult for them to do that, and it will also be much easier for them to experience the consequences themselves personally for their sin. And so that is the scenario. That is the setting. That is what is taking place now as a result of him just simply removing himself, just simply turning away. Going up into verse 9, and then I'll go to verse 10. In verse 9 at the beginning, I wrote that the recognition in their faces testifies against them, and their sin is like Sodom. Now, to say that the recognition in their faces testifies really says that people have a tendency to show their personalities. They do. They have a tendency to show their personalities. And I have not personally done an exhaustive study on this subject to be able to tell you how or in what ways you might be able to just look at the attitude that somebody has in their face and know all kinds of things about them. But you probably know what I mean, at least. That on occasion, you may spot someone walking down the street or in the supermarket or at the gas station, and you just look at their face and you can just sense some things about them. Have you ever noticed that? Okay, now I don't have an exhaustive study. I can't give you great comparisons. I just want you to maybe be a little sensitive to that, maybe in the future, and guess, all right? Make some guesses about the kind of person that they are. What are they testifying of in terms of what they value, what they feel is important in life? Now, I'm saying just make some assumptions and do so intentionally so that perhaps one day you might be able to validate or invalidate those assumptions. For example, if you're in a public setting where you may have access to somebody, you may be able to engage in a conversation with somebody, step aside a little bit and just study them for just a moment. Maybe take a mental picture and so you're not staring at them and then look off at the corner of some plant or something and while thinking about what you just saw. Make some assumptions. Go and talk to them and find out that you were completely wrong. All right? That you had no clue. You just didn't understand it all, so that you can correct yourself for the next time when you do that. And perhaps over time you might grow to learn some things. Maybe the Lord will share some discernment with you about some things, about some people. It's good to be wrong in this case because it tells you that you're wrong and that your assumptions were wrong and that you can make some adjustments and corrections. And you will learn, of course, that there are some people who you will never be able to read their faces at all. Okay? You'll never be able to do that. But on occasion, you may learn some commonalities and see commonalities, and so that you can see that there are people who have sins, they are proud of those sins, and they testify of those sins through the look in their face. And then one day you'll be able to look at these people, and whoever they may be, and say, you know what, I think that this person has this kind of sin in their life, and they are really excited about it. And they are proud about it. That's what I mean. Over time, you may be able to see that. And that can be the sin of what? What kind of pride is manifested in their heart and in what way? Now, of course, be sensitive with people, and remember to always allow room to be wrong. All right? You have to do that, otherwise you're just being rude at that point. Okay? So don't do that to people. But what he is saying here in verse 9 is that it has become self-evident. It has become completely self-evident, which is the theme from chapter 1 and chapter 2 that I explained earlier, that it is self-evident, and he's narrowing the focus from the self-evident nature of the society, of the towns, of the villages, of the communities, of the judges. He's narrowing it down, all the way down to the looks on individual people's faces. It has become self-evident that they are like Sodom. And so for those of you who have been following along with this study for the last 6 months, you will know what I mean when I say self-evident. That should ring a bell. Bring some memories back to the thematic approach for him calling upon the heavens and the earth to testify as witnesses for the sins that have been committed in the violation of the covenant. Right? All right, here's another way for him to say that it is self-evident and the sin is like Sodom. They declare, they do not conceal and cease. That combination of words, conceal and cease, is a better way to describe that single word that just means conceal or hide or something. It's not just concealing and hiding, but there is an intensity behind that word that has not been adequately described, I believe. For those of you who are Hebrew grammarians, it's in the PL verb form, the intensive, and it just is not very well conveyed. And I don't know of a good English equivalent in order to adequately communicate that besides putting that conjunction together of conceal and seize. But that's really where it's at. Woe to their souls, their very being. They brought evil upon themselves, right? This is not God's doing. It's not His responsibility. He doesn't have to do anything. They're doing it to themselves. Okay? They're doing it to themselves. He says, woe to their souls. He actually says, oi. Right? I'll put that Hebrew word in there. To their souls. Now this word that he uses for soul is the same word that he used in Genesis to describe the creation of living beings. I mean, it's a word that describes the nature of a person, their very existence, their very being. Not just woe to their flesh, not just woe to their lives, not just woe to them in general, but woe to their very existence as a living being. Woe to that. They have destroyed themselves to the very core of who they are. And it is so self-evident. It's on their faces. They've done it to themselves. Alright, so what did he say from there? In verse 10, tell the righteous that good. Alright, now, this is awkward. And I'll tell you why it's awkward. It's because he uses two kinds of conjunctions, one after the other, and it's like he's stuttering. It's like he's interrupted. It's not nearly as bad as something like Genesis chapter 4, verse, I think it's 7, where he spoke in an incomplete sentence. That was rough. Okay, but in this case, it's kind of like a little stutter, is what it is. And I think it's very, very hard to translate very well. You might take that second that and maybe write because in there, maybe pencil that in. You could put something together. If you look at the word-for-word translation that I wrote above, I put a set of ellipses, 3 dots there, and I didn't put that in the thought for thought. I did that to remind myself to look at this more closely. Okay, it's just a little way of me describing that there's this great discrepancy between the two. I have to spend more time with this. All right? But one way that makes it easier for me to get through this bit of a stuttering, that good, that what, that this, remember, there is no one who is good. There is no one who is righteous. If the definition is according to the law, no one will ever be declared righteous through the law. Ever. And so there is an opportunity to stutter a little bit here. Where he says, tell the righteous that good. Well, who are we going to tell? Alright? Who are we going to tell? What do we say? Who? There is none. Right? Remember the previous verses? Chapter 2. I think it was from chapter 2. Sorry, I can't quite remember. Be as pure as God, which was quoted by Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. Be as perfect as God. Right? Tell the righteous that good. Well, let's stutter on that one for just a moment, because there won't be any. But if there were, we could say that they will eat the fruit of their deeds, if there were any. Which would be a good thing, right? Well, everyone is going to eat of the fruit of their deeds, of course. Woe to the wicked, woe to evil, wicked, because the recompense of his hands, it will be done to him. They'll eat the fruit of their deeds as well. They will experience that. All right? And what's interesting is that he uses this word righteous in verse 10 and then wicked in verse 11 to distinguish in the same way that Abraham spoke of Sodom, which is the context here. He said, will you destroy the righteous with the wicked? There's a partial quotation that exists here by the words that he chose between verse 10 and 11 making a reference back to Abraham negotiating with God over the righteous and the wicked in Sodom. He uses those same words, but he stutters briefly. At least in Sodom he found one. Right? He could pull a lot out, but here, it's so bad. This is going to be awkward. Awkward enough to make the grammar awkward, to show that, there may be none who would be righteous. And if they are, still, they won't be declared righteous by the law, only by faith. Only by their trust and their recognition that they have no hope outside of the mercy of God. But this is still the law. It's still the old covenant. And he says, those who are righteous, they will eat the fruit of that. Now, for those who believe that they are righteous, even they would stutter. Even they would hesitate. Because they would know that deep down inside they've got some wickedness in them. Knowing full well that if this really is going to unfold in this way, that they're going to get some due to them as well that they don't want. And so this is good cause to pause and stutter a little bit over this. Because there truly is none righteous. In the end, everyone will fit into the category of verse 11. You understand? Everyone fits into the category of verse 11. The recompense of their hands, it will be done to him. Everyone. If we use the law as the standard. Which is why we need a Messiah. Right? I mean, we really do. We really need a Messiah. Now remember the bigger conflict. The bigger conflict of, do we live by the knowledge of good and evil, or do we live by the indwelling presence of the Holy Spirit? Don't forget the greater point of view. When we get narrowed in on something specific in some specific time period like this, it can be hard to forget the bigger picture. So don't do that. Remember the bigger picture. The bigger picture is, do we live according to that which is good and evil? Or do we live according to a different way of life, which is through the indwelling presence of the Holy Spirit? Those are two completely different things. And what he suggests here is in accordance with the law. Do that which is good. Do not do that which is evil. But can you hear him say that we are still resolving the question? We're still answering the question of, do we live by the knowledge of good and evil or not? Now, the knowledge of evil and living according to that which is evil, well, that's easy. Right? That's easy. If you're evil, you get punished accordingly. But what if you do that which is good? Oh, now you're in real trouble. Right? I mean, you're in real trouble because you just deceived yourself into thinking that you did. And then what? It's helpful to review what causes sin. Right? We have the natural rebellion of humanity, for example. Don't be telling me what to do, or what not to do. I am my own God. I will commit sin if I want to. And let me show you. Right? I mean, that stirs up sin through the law. What about the example that Paul gave on coveting? I would not have known what it was to covet until the law says don't covet, and it stirred up within me every covetous desire. Just don't tell me the law, and I won't have that problem. Okay, so the increase in the study and the dependency on the law will stir up sin as we look for loopholes in order to get through it, as an example. Okay, then we have the religious pride that gets developed in the event that you feel you have found some way to obey the law. And as you probably have experienced, religious people can be some of the meanest people you ever run across. Right? Because they say things like, now I have overcome this sin. And I'm glad to meet you and to know that you are struggling with this sin. So don't worry, I am now in your life, God has put us together, so that I will be able to help you overcome this sin. And to do that, I will beat you as much as is necessary, perhaps. I will condemn you enough. I'll give you some accountability opportunities, things like that, right? Now, that is absolute religious pride, is what that is. Stirred up from the pursuit of that which is good. When you feel you found a way to accomplish it, there you go. You got an increase of sin in your life. It's just different sins, if not still the same one that kind of hangs around as residual. All right, but then you got something worse. If you have done that which is good, if you have, or if you're pursuing that which is good, well, then you don't need the love of God. And I've given an example of this previously where people will start out, in their faith, needing a lot of Jesus. Right? I mean, you get first saved, you're all messed up, you don't obey anything with respect to God. You just need a lot of Jesus in your life. But don't worry, as you grow and mature, and you become more obedient to God, you may only need about 20% Jesus. And then, as you become pastoral material, 5% Jesus. And doesn't that sound bizarre? I mean, it's supposed to sound bizarre. It is bizarre. Okay, that we look at Jesus as the compensation for when we fall short. And that's bizarre. I mean, it gives people a license to sin even. I can sin because I didn't need a lot of Jesus last week, so this week a little extra can help. It'll keep me humble. It'll give me a way to talk with people and let them know that I'm one of them. Okay. I mean, can you hear the pride in that? I mean, the pride in there, it just oozes out of there. And what's worse is that when people realize that deep down inside they have failed to live in obedience to the law, then they know that God is truly disgusted with them, secretly perhaps, but He's disgusted with them. And so they cannot embrace His acceptance and His love, which means that they are easier targets for sin in their lives. They need some sin in their life as a break from all the pressure that they're under. Okay? The pursuit of that which is good leads to more sin. The pursuit of that which is evil, well, that's easy. But the pursuit of that which is good, it can be harder to catch these things, but they surface and they create more destruction. So what does He say? Do that which is good and you'll get the fruit of it. Yeah, well, if you fail, then you'll get the fruit of wickedness like everybody else. All right? Consider Galatians chapter 5, where he speaks of the fruit of the Spirit, right? He doesn't speak of the fruit of the Spirit here. It's not here. He speaks of the fruit of the law. So you have to go to Galatians chapter 5 and go a few verses above that, where he talks about the fruit of the flesh, or the evidence of the flesh. Okay, I'll turn to there just for a moment. Galatians chapter 5. Because I know that some of you might not be familiar with this. And of course, I did do a verse-by-verse study on Galatians all the way through. But if you're going to listen to that one, make sure you listen to the verse-by-verse study I did on Acts first. Make sure you do that first before you go to Galatians. In fact, before you listen to Acts, make sure you listen to baptism. In fact, before you listen to baptism, make sure you listen to Hanukkah. Those transitions you have to go through. Okay, so Galatians chapter 5, which I keep flipping back and forth from. Galatians chapter 5, at the end of chapter 5, you'll see the fruit of the Spirit. And of course, there's lots to be said about that. But it's not being said here in Isaiah chapter 3, verse 9 through 11. It's not there. What we see is a little bit earlier in chapter 5. Start out in verse 18. Galatians chapter 5, verse 18. But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law. Okay, but that's the new covenant. That's beyond what I'm speaking about this morning. In verse 19, now the works of the flesh are evident. What I want you to see from verse 18, if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law. But if you are under the law, verse 19 applies. The works of the flesh are evident, which are adultery, fornication, uncleanness. He just starts listing them out. This is the fruit of the law, because the law stirs up sin. It stirs up sin in the various ways that I just described. All right? So when he says they will receive the fruit that they are due, in accordance with the pursuit of the knowledge of good and evil, to know that which is evil, to not do that, and to know that which is good, and to try to do that, will lead you to the point of the fruit being what you're not necessarily wanting to get. And why everyone will filter down into verse 11 to receive not only, to experience not only the consequences of their sins being experienced by others, but they will also receive the consequences of their sins themselves. And God will find some way to ensure that that is realized at some point. Everyone will fall in there. Which is why it is necessary to have a Messiah, as I explained earlier, who will restore to us the life of God that had been lost in Adam, who will provide us with forgiveness so that we may be set free from the law, so that a door can be opened to walk in a newness of life that has nothing to do with that at all. And the newness of life has to do with living by the Spirit, not by the law. And when we live by the Spirit, there is a completely different way of life. A reasonable summary of that is to look at the fruit of the Spirit from the point of view of it being the fruit of the Spirit. I'm pausing for a moment there because you probably have considered this to be your fruit, right? You know, people say, well, my role in the church is to be a fruit inspector. Have you ever encountered anybody like that? You know, they show up every once in a while. They just don't tell you that until later. Okay? Now, it's the fruit of the Spirit, which means that this is something that the Spirit gives and you eat. Not that you give so that somebody else may eat. Now, that, of course, is a dynamic that does happen as a person rests in Him. But first and foremost, a person must receive what he has to offer. So the fruit of the Spirit is love. That comes from the Spirit. If you do not have the Spirit, you cannot be loved by the Spirit. If you are under the law, you cannot be loved by the Spirit because the Spirit is disgusted with you. Because you have failed to observe all of the law. But don't worry, we'll only teach part of it. You know, those that are easy for you. Then you can be loved. And that's, you know, that is a lie, right? No, if you're going to teach them, really teach it. Give it to them. All right? All of it. Do not bear a grudge against your neighbor. All right? I mean, you know, Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18. Really, you know, give them the law, right? All right, but that's how people handle it. They just do part of it and so they can get away with it, I suppose. But no, you cannot be loved when you're under the law because you can never observe all that is required. You must deceive yourself and live only by part of it, those that are easier for you to obey. Okay? And then you can get some religious pride when you condemn those who can't. But they can probably obey others that you can't do very well at. And then you're in real trouble. So kick them out of the church. Okay? Then you don't have access to them, or they don't have access to you. People struggle with these things, and they deal with them in all these bizarre ways. All right, but do you understand? You must rest in the forgiveness of sins to be the recipient of the love that He has for you, the peace that He has for you, the long-suffering, the kindness, the goodness, the faithfulness, the gentleness, and you will then grow to understand more about His self-control. All right? And He needs no law in order to do that for you. He does not have a need for a law, and there is no law against those things either, which is what he says in verse 23. Galatians chapter 5. So you have the fruit of the flesh, or the fruit of the law, and then you have the fruit of the Spirit. In Isaiah chapter 3, we're talking about the fruit of the law, not the fruit of the Spirit. Because it is the time when the question is being answered. Do we live according to the knowledge of good and evil or not? God finally reconciled that issue when He came personally to speak of the law one more time before He died and rose from the dead and instituted the new covenant. All right? So I wanted to spend some time giving you a big picture perspective this morning so we don't get lost in the details. And I'll proceed with some more details next week. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for this time that we could spend to review the Scriptures. Lord, I do pray that you will give us some more insights concerning the differences between the Old and the New Covenant, and that we may receive what you have for us so that we may be filled, we may be able to live in accordance with what you have given, as opposed to what we think we might be able to generate, produce, or give to you. And I thank you for this in Jesus' name. Amen.